Here we are, August 6th, 2016. I'm Marcia Bowen. I'll be joined by my husband, Peter Bowen. And we're going to discuss today how great minds of history have been able to live their lives in the present. Lyndon and Helga LaRouche certainly have done that through the years. Live their lives in the present to create the future that they have intended. And although we're not secured that future yet, there is a method to that kind of thinking. And that's what we're going to be discussing here today. And from that standpoint, a method of how one lives one's life so that in the travails of what is going on today, and certainly we couldn't be in a more dangerous period of human history than where we are right now. And yet, the opportunities have never been greater. Today happens to be the 71st anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And there's a lot of commentary. And imagine, just think about it for a minute. If Franklin Roosevelt had lived to see this period of his time on August 6th, we would not have bombed Hiroshima. We didn't need to bomb Hiroshima. And that's a very controversial subject, maybe not to the people in this room right now, maybe it is. But General MacArthur had already secured the Japanese islands in such a way that we could have easily starved them out. We had them so surrounded, even a fish couldn't get through, is the way MacArthur put it. So there was no reason to drop the bombs on Hiroshima nor Nagasaki, but this was Truman. This was Bertrand Russell. And this is our enemy's faction. But imagine even to this day, there's controversy over whether the United States should continue with the doctrine we have right now. Our doctrine is launch on warning right now. Our doctrine is first use of nuclear weapons. And there was, even in commentary today, an American was quoted to say, quote, "We should not ban the first use of nuclear weapons. That's been our strong card against conventional combatants such as China." Now, for those of us who know some history of Lyndon LaRouche, we know that LaRouche was involved in the early 80s with Reagan on developing the Strategic Defense Initiative, actually had run for president on that policy since 1976. We could have eliminated through technological development with, at the time, LaRouche's idea of working with the Soviets, we could have built the technology to make nuclear weapons obsolete. And we would have jump-started an economic miracle, frankly, for both the East and the West. But you might recall within weeks of Reagan being inaugurated, and LaRouche was to have a very substantial role in the Reagan administration, Reagan was shot. And that set the tone for the Bush senior crowd to come in. And increasingly, LaRouche was isolated, even though the Strategic Defense Initiative policy did continue for the years that Reagan was capable of continuing to fight for that. But it never became what it should have, which was policy, or the economic policies LaRouche intended. So just think where we are today. As Helga LaRouche puts it, the world is blowing apart, and yet the elites are unable to even question what they're doing. Today's, back in mid-July, there was an article in the London Guardian saying that the world is taking its revenge against the elites. The political class is venal, and the population is uprising. I think we've seen this in the phenomenon around Bernie. We've seen this in the phenomenon, well, it's not a phenomenon, the growing emergence of Glass-Steagall, the fight on Glass-Steagall regulations on the banks, the Chilcot Committee report back in July, where you have Lord Chilcot of Britain finally releasing a report that's been sitting on somebody's desk for some years on the crimes of Tony Blair and the startup of the war in Iraq. And of course, just on July 15th, the 28 page is released. So if you think about it, we've had the Brexit vote back in June, where the British people have voted out of the European Union. You're seeing the population is saying no to this system. But what are they going to demand instead? That's what we're here to discuss today. How Lyndon and Helga were able to establish over decades the policies which are now available. Glass-Steagall, the great projects, working with Russia and China for economic development, and ensuring that we don't end up with a terrible tragedy, which is what we will have if we don't succeed now. I'll just point out, this week we have released a leaflet. You can get this on your way out. Obama launches yet another criminal war on Libya. You know, to think that this president has not been challenged, has not been removed from office, and clearly, as we will also be publishing this week, and this will go out in Manhattan first, but we'll be getting it out around the country, a new broadsheet called the Hamiltonian, which will be an ability for us in Manhattan and across the country to have LaRouche playing a leadership role in shaping the presidency. LaRouche may be a few months shy of 94 years old, but he is still the greatest strategic thinker on the planet today. And the broadsheet for this week, going out as of Tuesday into Manhattan, hasn't been fully approved, so I couldn't show you a facsimile of it, but it will be something to this effect. It will have, it's, you know, newspaper size, and at the top it'll say, LaRouche, Hillary is Obama's stooge for wars and Wall Street. And then it will also have on the front page, petition to expose the 9/11 terror networks and end perpetual war. And on the back, it will have the new presidency with LaRouche's 4 laws and a small box that says, Hillary ought to be ashamed of herself for being herself.
That's good.
Right away on your way out, there is this petition, and it's also available online. We should be getting signatures on this petition.
It says what?
It says, expose the 9/11 terror network and end perpetual war. And it has 5 categories of things we must get done. The first we've checked off, which is the opening of the 28 pages. And we have to get the full exposure of the deals that were made going back to 1985 between Prince Bandar and Margaret Thatcher, the Al Yamama deals,
Yeah.
which traded oil for weaponry and created a slush fund off the books that has financed terrorism.
That's right.
We need a thorough investigation of the FBI's role and cover-up of the terrorism, and it's fully available. I mean, even in the 28 pages, which, by the way, here's my copy. You can get it off Google. Google 28 pages. And if you have trouble finding it, because apparently they're trying to blank out some of the sites for it, just let us know. We'll find it for you. It is available, but there are
They
hundreds.
keep disabling links.
They keep disabling links, but they can't stop us.
Yeah.
Because we're human beings, so they can't disable us, right?
They
Use our minds and our mouths.
Applications.
Well, they'd like to disable about 1,450 people worldwide.
Yes. Russ is pointing out they would like to get rid of about 6 billion people. We'll be discussing that today because that is the empire. And that's what we're up against. We're up against something that has been the fight from the beginning of our nation and frankly going back to the Roman Empire, which is the difference between what is man and what is an animal. The nation state versus world government. Just so you know, the other demands is we want a Chilcot committee inquiry here on the role of Bush and the Obama administrations on getting into the Iraq war. If they can do it in Britain, they can open an investigation against Tony Blair. Why can't we do it here? This is the United States of America, for goodness sakes. And the cover-up. And lastly, and frankly, probably most importantly, the United States collaboration with Russia Because right now, Russia is conducting the most effective war on terrorism in what they have done in cooperating with the Syrian government in the fight against ISIS in Syria. And the Russian government is asking the United States, why are you backing the, quote, moderate terrorists in Syria? The biggest fight that the Russians and the Syrians are up against is that ISIS is not just one group. You have many groups. You have al-Nusra, and al-Nusra keeps changing its name.
Yep.
And then we say some of these groups are our terrorists. I mean, they say rebels, our guys. So you can't bomb them. And right now, the siege of Aleppo, which is pretty much going to be probably the turning point in what happens in the war against ISIS, a very important city for many reasons historically in Syria, is being determined. And the siege is very difficult for the Russians and the Syrians, largely because of the United States having worked with the so-called moderate rebels and armed them and trained them. So going back to what I started with, here we are on the 71st anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. But we have a new paradigm that we've created that, had FDR lived, would have been the paradigm that would have been realized right away had he been well enough to do it. But Mr. LaRouche took up the challenge where FDR left off, largely actually where John F. Kennedy left off. And today, we hope to give you a sense that this new paradigm is not only alive, but it's growing almost by the day. And this is what we should be taking in and then going out and, you could say, sharing the good news with others. So, Pete, you want to start? Oh yeah, what we want to do, thank you, is actually just, there's a 6-minute video of Helga LaRouche from a speech that she delivered at the T20 summit. This was the think tank summit, T20, in Beijing last week. And Helga was one of the first panelists that spoke. She describes when she got there, this is in Beijing, this is in prelude to the G20 summit of heads of state that'll be occurring in another month in China. And Helga was asked to come because Helga is famous in China as the Silk Road lady. She's not only made these ideas her own, she's made these ideas so well known in China, and she's had innumerable trips into China, that that's how they have dubbed her, the Silk Road lady. And if you haven't seen our pamphlet on the new Silk Road, we have one just outside the door on our table. But as she got to the conference, she was describing that there were a number of Europeans there, Germans included, who were not so happy that Helga LaRouche was there. These are some of the greenie types. If you know the name Schellenhuber, he is the energy minister for the government of Germany. And he's brought in the policy in Germany of shutting down all the nuclear power plants.
Oh, no.
He's the guy who says that he's actually demands that you call him commander of the British Empire. Commander of the British Empire. He is a British knighted lord, whatever it is. He has been CBE, that's what he wants after his name, Commander of the British Empire. And CBE, Commander of the British Empire. And he has devised the green policy, which is, like we've said, reduce the population. How? Oh, by arguing that we're producing too much of a carbon footprint. You've heard that before, right?
Yes.
We're breathing too much CO2 emissions. I guess we have to cut off the CO2 emissions that plants love. You know, the green plants love our emissions.
Trees love, right?
And of course, the plants give us the oxygen. There's a beautiful
Give and take.
creation here, yeah, give and take. But now we're supposed to throw that to the to the anti-science wolves who were going to take over like Schellenhuber. Anyway, these types were at the conference amongst others. They were not too happy to see Helga there. But she was on the first panel, and what I want to do, Pete and I'd like to do, is just start with her presentation, and then we will have more to say. Okay, so we should.
the idea is the future, right? And somehow each of you has decided you want to do something about the future, because something you want that would be better, or something you don't like and want to avoid, right? I mean, that's why you're here, I hope. Right? I mean, we'd like to avoid nuclear war, like to get rid of unemployment, we'd like to, you know, make inaccessible healthcare accessible, you know, that kind of thing, right? And so the idea then is to realize that to the extent you are operating on that basis, on some basis like that, you are living in the future. You're acting in such a way as to be a part of a future you want. And let's take for a minute that we were going to talk about China. And let's think about joining China, setting up bases on the far side of the moon. Now, you know, think about that for a minute. You're going to set up bases on the far side of the moon with China.
It'll be pretty dark.
Not necessarily.
No. I know we're going to be getting the sun rays
No,
before we get
It's
them.
light half the time.
Oh, okay.
Besides, we have fusion power.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the idea is that images come to your mind, right? That you start thinking about what first came to my mind is, you know, walking around with weighing about 1/3 of what I weigh, you know, so I'd be able to bounce 1/6. Is that what it is? 1/6. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So you'd be bouncing around, right? It'd be pretty easy, right? Or the idea of having watched that movie about going to the moon from the 20s.
Oh, yeah. Frau am Mond.
Yeah, Frau am Mond. The idea is that you're going through in a projectile in a vacuum, just, you know, like going up in a tomato can. And, you know, what kind of propulsion would you have? Maybe you were thinking about how would you eat? How do you eat in space? You know, you swallow, but there's nothing to pull it down into your stomach. How do you get it down there? You know, do they have exercises for your esophagus? You know, or maybe you started thinking about getting along with the Chinese government. What do you have to do? You know, are you going to trust them? That kind of thing. And would we be working in the same laboratories on the same projects? Would we split it up? You know, how would you go about doing this? How would you share solutions to the problems that you encounter? So you start thinking about this, and when you start thinking about all the different elements of what it takes to bring into being a new situation, something different on the planet, then you're living in the future. Which is an interesting idea, right? And now Lynn's been talking about this for some time. But what I wanted to do now is I'd like to show some of this ways in which, show pictures of the ways in which Lynn and Helga have been living in the future over the past decades. You know, they've been at this since 1968, right? Now, for those of us that have been around for a while, remember this, 1975, the International Development Bank. How's it going to work? And this was all organized around the idea of the chaos that was being built up in the Middle East, and the fact that the plug had been pulled on a lot of these poor nations where, due to the oil crisis, the cost of running their economies dramatically increased. And so that debts which they had incurred prior to the oil crisis, those debts now became unpayable because they had to buy the oil instead of pay the debt. You know, that kind of problem. It's kind of like what they did in the 80s to our savings and loan institutions, if you remember. The Paul Volcker raised the interest rates up to 20% and more. And in so doing, the savings and loan institutions, in order to get money, they had to borrow it. They had to borrow it, from the Fed, or they borrowed it from the big banks or whatever, because they wanted to invest in the local homeowner. They wanted to invest in the local businessman. And the problem was that they had to pay such enormous interest rates for the money they were borrowing. They couldn't charge that easily, to their customers, which were used to getting, fixed mortgage rates at 6, 7, 8%. And they were borrowing money at 20%. So how can they make money if the money that they take in costs them, 20%, and then they can only loan it out for 6 or 7? And the whole Soviet savings and loan setup collapsed. It blew up.
And the bankers overcame their resistance to those rates.
Yeah. Well, the ones that didn't left the business, right?
Yeah.
And what
Died
you're
of
left with
heart
is the thieves. So in this, so that's where this comes from, and then this is the drive to work with the nations of South America that had been ruined by that same process. And so let's go on. Let's go to the next thing.
I want to just point out, those are pamphlets that we got out at the time.
Well, yeah. The IDB pamphlet was a little thing about 30 or 40 pages. The other one, this is a book. This is a book of about 150 pages or so. This was in 2005, I think, is when that was put out, and that had to do with looking forward to these newplexes. The Eurasian Landbridge idea was on the table, and what do we have to do to bring that about? This was a conference, the Kraft Memorial, I think it was 85, is that right? 1985? So that goes, this is 20 years earlier than that. And this was a discussion of what do we have to do to colonize space. Let's go to the next one. When the Fusion Energy Foundation came into existence, which was about 1975, one of the principal reasons for this was the conditions in Africa were getting horrible, and the food supply was in great danger. And we started working with all different elements. We had networks in Egypt, we had networks in Nigeria, we had networks to some extent in South Africa, and we laid out a whole plan of water projects and infrastructure development and power plant development for the industrialization of Africa.
Railroads.
Yeah, railroads. Yeah, that was the key thing. Railroads. And this is, I think this is either the initiation or the spin-off of what LaRouche called the Oasis Plan for the Middle East. Is that here you've got wars that are continuously being organized in the Middle East, and the way to overcome it was economic development. I remember when we were working with Israeli and Palestinian networks, the big issue was, are you going to solve these things by political negotiations? And what Lynn kept saying is, no, you can't do that. You gotta put a shovel in the ground. You gotta start development. You gotta create an environment where everybody realizes this really is going to happen. Really is going to be development. There's going to be water projects. There's going to be power. There's going to be transport in the region. And you're not going to succeed in any political development unless you put shovels in the ground. And they almost got it. And then they assassinated, is it Yitzhak Rabin?
Yeah.
Rabin, yeah. Yeah, assassinated Rabin. So they succeeded in undermining the drive that had been put into motion. Let's go to the next one. I don't know if people remember this, but was it in the 80s when They nationalized the banks in Mexico,
I think it was 1980.
1980.
It might have been 81.
Right. It was like before Reagan came in, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And this was the plan. This was the plan that Lynn had put into motion. And then a couple of years later, we were talking about the development of the Eurasian Landbridge.
I think it's really important that the metaphor on the,
Oh, that's from the Malvinas.
right, but the metaphor he's making is that you're not going to beat this empire through military confrontation, but that the weapon that is even the greatest power is to force the creation of a new financial system that'll be based on development.
Right, what's being said, you might not be able to hear, is that there's a metaphor here that you're not going to overcome the enemies of development by military operations, by war. The only way you're going to do it is by getting a new financial structure that allows for development.
And therefore the debt bomb.
Oh, the debt bomb, yeah, right, the debt bomb, yeah. This was based on the idea that in South America, all they had to do was stop paying their debts, and the whole financial structure would simply collapse.
Or bring them to the negotiating
Bring them
table.
to the negotiating
Right.
table.
We're going to renegotiate the debt because the debtors cartel, otherwise it's going to repudiate all of the debts that are owed to your bank right now.
That's right.
LaRouche had met with President Portillo on this.
Yeah, right, yeah. They had become allies, close allies. And then Portillo was scandalized or something and driven out of the government.
Yeah, like they're doing in Brazil right now.
Yeah. And in Argentina.
Yep.
Okay, so let's go to the next one. Where are we here? Okay, this is the 50-year development policy for the Indian and Pacific Ocean basins. This was August 1983. President Reagan had adopted LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative in March 23 of 1983. Reagan had been shot in 1981 in March of 1981.
Mm-hmm.
And which significantly set him back and gave the Bush forces a pretty powerful opportunity to move in to control his administration. But so we'll come back to this. Let's go, where are we now? Okay. This was 1989 in that vicinity, because that's when LaRouche was put in jail by George H.W. Bush. And the idea that when the wall came down, the idea was that if we could get this triangle from Berlin to Paris to Vienna, which encompassed an area which was approximately the size of Japan, the land area of Japan, but it was the most heavily industrialized area of the world. And if that could be harnessed for a policy of development globally, and if we go, see, where are we right now? We're right here. If we can go down to these three slides here, there, that's the triangle. Okay, I go to the next slide. So the idea was that you would have arms of development that would come off this triangle, right? And it's hard to see here on this because it's not, the resolution isn't very good and the map's too small. But there's a spiral arms that are coming out this way. There are spiral arms that are going down here, out this way, down. And implicitly, the idea is, of course, to go across at these points into Africa.
Straight to Morocco.
Yeah, straight to Gibraltar and crossing here. So that's the idea of these, of getting that process going, and this became quite an extraordinary idea, and began leading the world in thinking. So what I want to do is I want to go back to the 50-year development policy of the Indian Pacific Ocean Basin, because I think that when you're trying to, and you can turn on the lights if you want. When I was thinking about Lynn's and Helga's drive to understand the future, or to create the future, to live in the future, this was pretty interesting to me, the idea of the 50-year development policy in the Indian Ocean, because now this is August of 1983, and there are 5 projects that are identified there. One is the new Panama Canal. There's the Kra Canal. There's the water control of the Mekong River and its delta, and the water control for the Brahmaputra-Ganges River, and then the Grand Canal in China. Those are the 5 projects that are specified. And they're all very important from the standpoint of transportation. But the logic that leads to these projects is very instructive concerning Lynn and Helga's home in the future. The idea is that if you have such a vast region with such a large population and a variety of cultures is to be developed, just that idea is cause for trepidation. I mean, it's a huge region with a lot of different people in it. And, but not for Lynn and Helga. They had already become friends with Indira Gandhi as a result of LaRouche exploring ties developed during World War II, having been there as a medic in the Army. And he actually had witnessed firsthand the machine gun massacre of peacefully protesting Indians for their freedom in Calcutta, which is now Mumbai, by the British military. And we had also succeeded in developing networks in Thailand, Malaysia, Japan, and elsewhere throughout that region. Michael Billington, who many of you know of, was in the Peace Corps over there, and he had developed a whole series of networks in that region, which he has done a wonderful job in nurturing and I guess he had the language too. He learned the language, so he was able to, work closely with these people, and has done a tremendous job in the whole area. So so when LaRouche says, okay, we want to develop this region, we want to develop this, all of this, this is what we want to develop here. Right? That's a really big region. And the question then comes, how are you going to get? You got to keep in mind, LaRouche is in the government. He didn't have a government paycheck, but he was the back channel that Reagan was using for to come up with the SDI, which had already been announced by August 1983. It had already been announced, and so he was saying to himself, he must have been saying something to himself about, well, how are we going to get these policies changed? How is this going to happen? Right? And because of what he had done with the effort to get the SDI, what he had to go through working with the militaries of Western Europe and the United States, looking for, finding people, and then beginning to understand how they thought. So, and of course, what he'd been doing for years prior to that in terms of the working with nations around the idea of economic development. So what did he have to do? Well, he ran into roadblocks. the unwillingness of the Anglo-American establishment to consider any process that would lead to the growth of independent, sovereign, modern industrial nations. Some of us remember Brzezinski's famous statement about not wanting to have another Japan south of our border. Right, this was at a point where Japan was.
Brzezinski.
What did I say?
Yeah.
Oh,
We just in here.
Oh, okay. The idea of having another Japan south of our border was against the rules. And Japan was thinking in terms of, well, let's see, how are we going to modernize our industry? Well, if we could take what we have here as manufacturing and ship it over there, and then invest in the latest, best technology here, they could be building stuff over there, and then we could be building the tools that build them the tools that build the tools, the machine tools that they need. So it was this idea of, okay, hand-me-downs, right?
A win-win.
Yeah, it's kind of win-win, right? Now, that's not the best approach, but that's what Japan was thinking in terms of. And at that time, we were working with the this Mitsubishi group. And this was an industrial group in Japan who had the idea of developing these nations. And we're trying to figure out, there's lots and lots of conferences were going on how to go about building this cooperation, how to make it happen. And they were always talk, lots of talk. Talk. Nothing ever happened. Nothing ever actually got done, except tourism.
Tourism, okay.
Yeah, tourism. That's what came out of these things, was tourism, and not development. So, where's this roadblock coming from? Why is this happening? Well, now this is where Lynn, when you read Lynn, right, you better have your encyclopedia ready, because the mastery this guy has of history is just amazing. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to go to a government functionaries, people who work in the policymakers, that's what I was looking for, policymakers, and explain to them why they can't even think about developing third world countries. They can't think about it. Why can't they think about it? Because they don't think in terms of win-win. They don't think in terms of how are we going to collaborate for development. They think in terms of, is this going to fit into America's sphere of influence? Is this going to be good for us? What kind of benefit are we going to get out of it? Are we going to get resources? Are we going to get cheap labor? What are we going to get? And that's the way they've been trained to think. And what Lynn does in this pamphlet is he goes through this incredible discussion of the emergence of the idea of spheres of influence, or of what we came to know as the blocs, the Soviet bloc and the free world bloc. And what countries are in what? Then there was the non-aligned movement that came around, and as China began to become more of a significant force, then okay, how are we going to have China? What's China's bloc going to be like? And our diplomats were thinking in terms of how are we going to make the Chinese into a roadblock for the Soviets? How can we manipulate them? How can we use them? Right? So he goes through how this thing actually comes about, where in World War II, at the end of World War II, Bertrand Russell was running around, complaining about how awful things were, and if we could just have a world government that would prevent these nations from fighting each other all the time.
What decade was that when he was pushing
40s, late 40s, early 50s. And that evolved into what was called the Pugwash conferences. And the thing that to keep in mind is that the Soviets were in the midst of this all the way along. They were working with Russell. They were working with the Pugwash movement. They were part of it. And at one point, Lynn uses the example of Afghanistan, where I can't remember where exactly it was that we were extending our influence. But it had to do with the Malvinas War, I think, as part of it, was part of that. And then there was some other area where the U.S. and Western forces were supposed to be gaining. And what Andropov did was he said, well, okay, you can do that, but Afghanistan is ours. So it was this trade-off, because these are the spheres of influence that the Pugwash committee or conference had organized. And I mean, it was the absurdity of it came out in that movie called Dr. Strangelove, which we've all seen, right? With you know, the the effort to keep the arm down. The yeah, right. Because this guy Shillard had actually proposed that we could have limited nuclear war between the blocs. And if one side really thought they were getting hurt too bad, then what they could do is they could simply announce, well, we're going to take out, Oklahoma City. And we'd have a couple of weeks to evacuate people from Oklahoma City, and then the Soviets would bomb it. This was actually a proposal, which is, obviously insane, right? It couldn't possibly ever happen.
They wound up bombing it anyway.
Yeah, right. But this is the kind of thing that the British Empire was organizing, right? And what Lynn does here is he goes back to the Peloponnesian Wars. He goes back to the time of Solon and Lycurgus, and he says, look, the idea in I guess it must have been about 300 BC that that Plato's Academy with Alexander were able to get Philip of Macedon assassinated, and destroy the effort to create a Western division of the Persian Empire, which Philip of Macedon had agreed to with the Persians. Rather than have a whole bunch of wars between Macedonia and Persia, the idea was, well, let's just be one empire and you can be the Western division. That was the idea. And it didn't work because Alexander, participated in the assassination of his father and took over and went out and basically destroyed the imperial drive and began the spread of what became, the Republican movement. Because that's where the republics come from. It comes from Plato's work. And the fact that Philip of Macedon was defeated and Alexander the Great was able to establish a different view of how things were done based on the reason coming out of Plato's Academy. So it's
building rather than looting, in other words.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that kind of thing. So now so what I'm trying to get you to see here, just bring it back to the focus, which is what Lynn is doing here is he wants to get the United States to work with nations for development. And these diplomats haven't got a clue about, they may say they're for it, but they don't know how to think. So you've got to go out and organize them. And that's what these pamphlets, all these pamphlets, if you read them, they're all filled with the same kind of commitment to get you to think about what are the forces you have to move, what are the forces that have to be shaped, right? And so in that way, he's living in the future. Right? He's actually saying, I want this to happen. How do I make it happen? And so he's done the work. He's studied the history. He's figured things out. And the other element of this, I mean, there's two basic things that he points to, is that you've got the lunatics with their mutually assured destruction, and then you have the Malthusian side of that, which is if nations which historically had resisted due to their rentier financier faction, the oligarchical faction, they historically had resisted advancing, investing in new technology, bringing the latest stuff online. And the only time it actually happened was when the issue of war came up, and you had to have the best weapons, you had to have the best science. So then the political pressure would be put on this rentier financier faction to allow investment in industry with the best technology. So that's
educate the people.
And of course then you have to educate the population to that science, that's the real danger, right? Is educating the population to know how to run the universe, and when you do that, they don't like being controlled. So if they know how to do it, they want to get done. So but once this idea of nuclear destruction, mutually assured destruction, had been established, then you could say, well, look, we don't need standing armies, except for little expeditions to put out fires here or knock out someone we don't like. Maybe we don't like Gaddafi, we'll go kill him, and we're going to go over and kill Assad. And maybe we don't like what's her name, Kirchner down in Argentina, right? And then we'll have military forces available to go crush them. But we don't need a big military establishment, because we can just push the buttons and everything will disappear. And that kind of thinking, right? So this is what opened the door for the Aquarian Age. When I was growing up, and a number of you are in my generation here, this was the Aquarian Age. This was the drug, rock, sex counterculture that was blossoming due to the efforts of Bertrand Russell and Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary and the Beatles and related things that brought us to the level of insanity which we've seen unfolding over the last 50 years, much to our horror, that has been going on. So where are we here? So what he's doing here is that he's trying to get the diplomats of the United States to recognize how we got into the mess, that it is a mess. They don't know it's a mess, except when things don't go exactly as planned, right? Then it's like the Bay of Pigs, right? Then they see a mess, but not until. And so this policy of educating the elite and organizing them to see what is necessary, what is good. And that's the other part of this thing, where what Lynn is doing is looking at the history of the Republican movement, the actual idea of building republics, which does come from Plato and comes from that period. And he sketches the political history behind that, and then he discusses the idea of what is known in theology as the filioque, which is the consubstantiality of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost kind of idea. And he puts it in terms of physics and the work of Kepler and the discoveries that were made that allowed certain, thinkers to realize that what was governing the properties of law in the universe that were governing what we see were not visible. They were invisible. And so the visible world was being governed by something outside it that wasn't visible. But man's mind participated in that invisible process. And so it allowed us to see behind the shadows. And so he developed that idea, which, he's been working on in various ways for a long time. So all of those projects that we see up there, and we can put them back up here. All of those projects are from the standpoint of, you want to hit the light, thanks, Tony. Are from the standpoint of, you've got an entrenched bureaucracy and oligarchical structure that doesn't allow for the development of these ideas as real. And what Lynn and Helga have been doing is fighting and fighting and fighting to find in leadership circles the quality that's necessary. Because one of the things that's been discussed, is that we're not going to have some kind of Jacobin uprising where angry people are going to rise up in the streets and change the world. That doesn't happen. But what can happen is that because of the nature of our culture, if you have leadership which draws on that, the beautiful part of our culture, if you have leadership for that, then they will get support. It's like when Reagan put forward the Strategic Defense Initiative. There was a significant layer that agreed with that. Now, of course, the media went wild attacking it, calling it Star Wars, and all that kind of stuff. But there was a very significant layer of the population which agreed with that kind of policy. Just like today, they would agree with working with China to go to the moon. But you have to have a leader that's going to stand up and move on that. And that's what the Hamiltonian, which Marcia referenced earlier, the Hamiltonian is going to be a way of showing people where that leadership is. And hopefully drawing some of it out, because Lynn and Helga are the leadership on that. And we want that drawn out of the population. But the population needs the leaders. It's like, for instance, the here in the Mekong River Delta, right here. There's a whole bunch of dams they want to build right there. And Mike, do you know about that? What they're building in there?
Well, China is working with nations involved to build some of those dams.
Right. Well, I know that in China, where the Mekong River actually rises, which is up in the Himalayas or up in Tibet somewhere, right? It rises up here. And then China already had like 3 or 4 dams up there. And they've been operating them for some time.
Isn't it the largest dam, the Three Gorges Dam? That's the largest dam in the world.
Yeah, but that's on the Ganges, and that's this East-West River.
Yangtze.
Yangtze, yeah. Yeah, it's the East-West River up here, so that's disconnected from that. But down here, the Mekong River can be harnessed for a lot of power and a lot of irrigation, controlled irrigation, to allow them to double or even triple rice production in the area. And as far as I know, there have only been 2 dams that have been built since the 1980s in there. But what's the issue over there? Why aren't they building them? Well, you got the World Wildlife Fund. You got the British interests, the imperial interests, are in there saying, oh, it's going to hurt this fishy. It's going to upset the ecological balance. It's going to do this. It's going to do that. Every time you want to get anything done, someone's going to do a study and say you can't do it. And but because China is now moving in this direction with their Silk Road, these projects are getting funding. And why is that happening? It's happening because starting in the 90s, Helga LaRouche was over there spreading these ideas. She was going to the universities. She was working with the networks that we had identified, or somehow we had figured out who to talk to over there. And she spent quite a lot of energy in putting together the people that want to see this happen in China. And one of the speeches at the T20 conference, I guess one at the end, specifically talked about that this is a Confucian policy idea, that you can't have collaboration unless you're concerned about the benefit of the other, which is exactly the basis for the nation state development, you know, in Western Europe, which occurred at the Peace of Westphalia back in 1648. So this is what China is doing today is totally coherent with what Helga and Lynn have been fighting for. They wanted leadership circles of the West to do what China is doing today. You know, that's what they were fighting for. But the bankruptcy of the leadership has been pretty extreme. And, you know, I mean, if you stood up and fought, you got killed. I mean, that's what happened with Kennedy. That's what happened with Martin Luther King. That's what happened with Bobby Kennedy. You know, you stand up and fight these people and they'll kill you. They put LaRouche in jail. So it's, that's the kind of problem that we have faced, that Lynn and Helga have faced. But China is big. And there's a lot of potential because it's just like Duterte, is that his name? Duterte, down here in the Philippines. He said, they want to come and build railroads? Well, I want to let them. Yeah, the Chinese, yeah, I want to let them. When, you know, Obama is trying to keep them from collaborating. He said, bring it on.
Right, yes.
Bring it right in here, you know? And it's so this is the hope of the world right now, is that if we can create the kind of circumstances where leadership circles in the West facing the crisis which is exploding in Europe right now, realize they have got to simply join hands with Russia and China on this stuff, a lot of our problems would disappear. You know, and the biggest one of which is pessimism, the cultural pessimism that says there is no future, there can't be a future. So,
Okay.
that's the idea there.
What I want you to do, Mike, is to go down to the map. I guess the maps are after the pamphlets. Yeah. Okay.
You want to keep going?
Keep going. Okay. Now this is, I'm just going to quickly show you some of what is on the agenda right now. In fact, on August 8th, the president of Russia, Putin, and don't ask me to say all these names, but there's going to be a meeting to bring together a north-south transport corridor out of Chahabar port. And this will go to Herat, Afghanistan. Iran and India are all ready to go on this. There was a foreign ministers meeting on this about 2 weeks ago. I've been actually every day looking in our briefing. Every day there are meetings of this nature. China is clearly going to personally benefit, I mean, as a nation, because you're talking about, you know, Turkmenistan is largely a gas. I know they have gas anyway as a resource. Obviously, this opens up a part for China, and with the sanctions just dropped against Iran, I mean, this has huge potential to open up a massive transport corridor. Next map. This is the Eurasian Landbridge, which was what is not. This is now, much of this is already built. Obviously, this still has to be built. The Bering Straits Tunnel. We're determined to get this built. This is planned.
They're building the railroad there up to Yakutsk.
Are they?
Yeah.
Where is that?
Right here,
there.
Yakutsk.
Uh-huh.
So, but a lot of this is already built, which, and I want to remind you, started as, I mean, it wasn't as if there weren't rail there in the years past, but that this has come together like a circulation system in a human body. And finally, you're beginning to see something that looks, you know, truly beautiful in terms of the development of mankind. Go on to the next map. This is another map and giving an idea again of what China is, you know, tying together. Just, you know, look at the phenomenal potential here. There's conferences going on between Sri Lanka and Malaysia in terms of ties to these countries. Obviously, this can tie into Africa. Obviously, there's a area, the Prague Canal, which would be, I think, up here.
Yeah.
Which, where this builds, and I think I have a map of it. This is something Lyndon LaRouche, when he ran for president in 1983,
Yeah.
he was in Thailand, a presidential candidate in Thailand, running for president of the United States for this project, because right now the only water route is through the Straits of Malacca, that you can move goods around, and it adds enormous time, plus moving goods from China, for example, over into this part of the world. Not only enormous time, but there's a lot of problems like pirates and such. So this is the conception, you could say. Go on. Next minute. Okay. Now, Helga LaRouche, not only in this webcast of 7:15, but last night again. This I found fascinating, where she said the only source of wealth is the creative power of the human being, and when that creative power is applied, then you have scientific and technological progress. That then leads to an increase of productivity in the economy. That has been the battle between the American Revolution and the British Empire, between the free traders and people like Alexander Hamilton, who insisted that it is the creative power of labor which causes the well-being and the living standard and the longevity of the people. That was the philosophy of Friedrich List, the great German economist, who is now the most famous economist in China, by the way. That was the policy of Friedrich List and Henry C. Carey, the advisor of Abraham Lincoln. And I'd like to know how many people in this room know of Friedrich List, or put it this way, how many don't know of Friedrich List? Has everybody in this room heard of Friedrich List? Okay.
Studying LaRouche.
If you studied LaRouche, you've heard of Friedrich List. But I found that just amazing. I had no idea. I had studied Friedrich List quite a bit myself some years ago, and he is somebody that you would say this was a great mind at the time that he lived, but that the idea that in China today that this is the American system is causing what Pete was saying earlier, that Lynn tried with various ideas to get the diplomats of the United States to move on, but you have ingrained in much of our diplomats and political leadership, they've been trained in the British system of thinking. They don't see human beings as creative. They're thinking in terms of the theory of value, you know, the exchange value, i.e. money.
They're also trained to think like the Darwinians.
meaning the survival of the fittest, the Darwinian principle, right? Like we're animals, as opposed to every human being, no matter what might be a human being might be a dwarf, might be a cripple, might be disabled, might be tall, might be short, might be black skinned, might be white skinned. There is within that human being a mind and a soul. And if you develop that, and if you have a government that's committed to that development, then you can actually unleash the kind of creative powers that China is now unleashing in their people. And not only in their people, but worldwide. We'll go to the next slide. This is interesting because this is a stamp from 1989. It's hard to read, but that's of course when the Berlin Wall came down. 1988, LaRouche as a presidential candidate was in Berlin speaking at the Kempinski Hotel.
In other words, that's a German post.
That's a German postage stamp, I'm sorry. And it's of Friedrich List. And you can see the railroads. He became famous for his contribution to the development of transportation by rail in not only Germany, but in the United States. But this is the stamp they put out in 1989 when the Berlin Wall had come down. A year earlier, LaRouche had forecast the reunification of Germany. And this is when the idea Lynn had to offer to the East, to Poland and other countries of the East, Western technology and Western banking methods of the American system, of the List tradition, of the Hamiltonian tradition, that you could take a country like Poland, which had been so kept backwards under communism, looted under communism, and with American system methods, you could develop the East. So I think it's appropriate that they put Friedrich List on the stamp, at least one of their stamps that came out in 1989.
With all those locomotives in the background.
Yeah, this was List. I'll go through that in a minute. List became he was the father of the rail transportation system of Germany, quite literally. Much of which, by the way, was not realized until years after he died. And again, here's an individual who lived in the future. And let me just leave that slide there where it is. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on Friedrich List, because there's a reason that, you know, when you think about Lynn, I don't know if people saw the movie Gandhi. People remember that movie?
Yep.
Remember the scene in which the British are mowing down the Indians?
Yes.
And these people are resisting how? By their bodies.
Right.
Non-violent resistance. And they're just mowed down by the British. You can't believe the scene. And I was thinking about it when I watched it, because that's what Lynn saw that you were describing earlier, Pete, in the streets of Calcutta. That unless you see what the British really do, you might think that we're just plain exaggerating. You know, we're just blaming, looking for, an enemy to blame. Well, this is the British method. And I think about Helga, earlier, before she went into China in the 90s, Helga actually went into China in, I believe, the 60s. 71, and she was a journalist, one of the first journalists to go into China during the Cultural Revolution.
Or Der Spiegel.
Even before Der Spiegel, you're saying?
No.
She worked for Der Spiegel. Oh, I didn't realize that. She worked for Der Spiegel. And was she on a cargo boat, a freight boat? Somebody knows the story better than I do.
Yes, he was on the
Go to China.
To China, all right. And, but Helga saw China in the most backward stages of communism, of the Mao Zedong period, of the Cultural Revolution. If you showed any proclivity to any Western training, you were tortured, you were killed. If you had glasses, if you could read, if you believed in, listening to Western music, you would be killed, reading books. Anybody who was educated. This is what they did under Mao Zedong, and she was in China at that time.
They put doctors in the rice paddy.
They would actually take educated people, break their glasses, and put them out into the work fields with the peasants. They would take classically trained musicians and break their fingers or kill them or torture them. Make sure that
they allowed Western journalists to right about that?
This is 71, this is 71, after the Nixon.
Breakthrough, oh, I
Yeah,
see.
yeah.
So she's seeing it just as it's coming
She
through
was one
that
of the
phase.
first journalists to go in after that, after the opening.
So I don't think otherwise any journalist got in. But I say that because when she goes into China now, as you saw at the T20 summit in the latest speech you just saw of Helga, she's speaking from personal experience, what China was and what China's become today. And as she said, you would not believe the transformation. And every time she goes back, there's more and more and more development. Well, getting back to Friedrich List and the idea that the most popular economist in China today is Friedrich List, which, by the way, today, August 6th, is Friedrich List's birthday. I mean, we didn't plan it this way. We're going to wish him a 227th happy birthday. So don't go anywhere when we're done because we got a little birthday party to have, okay? So we can celebrate the right way. Yeah, he was born August 6, 1789, in an area of Germany called Württemberg. If you want to read a biography of him, beware, because this is the one I found in English by Margaret Hurst. It was written in 1909, because she was trained at Cambridge, and her brother was the editor of the London Economist. And her brother was also a famed biographer of Adam Smith. Adam Smith was the pinnacle of British thought at the time of the American Revolution. He published a book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776 to directly counter the American Revolution. And fortunately, we had a Alexander Hamilton, and we had a Benjamin Franklin, and we had a George Washington. But by the end of the American Revolution, much of this generation is dying or has died. And at the time that Friedrich List is born, it's a few years after the American Revolution. Of course, he's born in Germany. Much of the American Revolution generation has died in America or is old. So Friedrich List is born into a family in which his father runs a tannery. And by, the old oligarchical method, if your father is a tanner, that is tanning the hides of animals,
And you're supposed to.
you're a tanner. Can you imagine in those days what it was like, how much it stunk, how much it was disgusting? And at the age of 14 years old, he found it completely distasteful. And he wouldn't put up with it. He actually asked questions like, why isn't our machinery being powered by that stream outside there? Why should we have to, have human labor powering these machines? He was thinking like that at the age of 14. And apparently it was quite a problem for the father and the brothers, because he would find ways to get out of work and go out and play or be outside, and he would encourage other workers to do the same thing. So finally his father said, okay, you're getting out of here. He was a bad influence on the tannery. So he becomes a Schreiber, which is a writer or a clerk in the Württemberg bureaucracy by the age of 17. And that simply means he's, copying documents. They did not have computers, they didn't have typewriters, so you had to have somebody who copied the documents. Pretty monotonous work, but obviously he became skilled at it. Later, he takes a post in Tübingen and takes up lectures at the university there. And apparently from various writings I've read of ours, that's where he learned about Leibniz. He learned about von Stein, Carnot. These are some of the great minds that are very important in the tradition of the American system. A couple stories that are told about him: that his father had died by the time he was 24 years old, and his mother one day is insulted by a public official because she had some trivial breach of a contract with a household worker, i.e. the bureaucracy of the day. She had violated some little thing. She was publicly insulted, and apparently she was so hurt that, so wounded emotionally, that she died within weeks. And he blamed that on the bureaucracy of the time. Similarly, his brother wanted to get married and sought exemption from going into the military. So he had to go between Reutlingen and Stuttgart for some kind of petty document, and his horse stumbled, he fell off, he died of his injuries. Again, some little petty document, and he died of the bureaucracy. That was the way that Liszt looked at it in his mind. So he was fiercely indignant at this bureaucratic system. And I'm just saying this because if you think about LaRouche, fiercely angry, very determined against the British Empire from what he personally saw as a young man. Helga, what she saw as a young woman going into China. So you have this man, Friedrich Liszt, a young man, very impressionable, but obviously very sensitive, very thoughtful. He goes on to become a chair of administration and politics at the Tübingen University. He begins writing, and I think what Pete was showing you about these pamphlets, you know, the best in history that have been carrying out revolutions of ideas, they do it through pamphlets, they do it through leaflets, or today we have the internet. Okay, true, but truthfully, we've got to get more people reading again and thinking. Yeah, you have many examples of history. During that time, he printed a pamphlet on this idea that no one had any conception of national economy. No one teaches the science, he said, this is Liszt, he's about 24 years old. Nobody teaches the science of agriculture, forestry, mining, industry, or trade. And he said, if some official of 2 centuries past came to work today, they'd fit right in, because there's been no advances of even the simplest processes of manufacturers. And so this is the way he thought. He and his friends founded a newspaper calling for self-government, trial by jury, freedom of the press. These were unheard of rights back in those days. And he became very obviously outspoken, and also became...
He was inspired by the American Revolution.
Well, this comes up in just a moment. He was of the same mind. I think that's what's interesting, right? Is that this mindset is human. This is not something that he learned from anybody in America yet. And he came to realize that, you know, he didn't want to be part of this bureaucratic system, and they didn't want him either. Metternich, who was one of the big controllers at that time in Austria, began to spy on Liszt. And long story short, Metternich, he was Metternich of Austria. Anyway, he was ultimately, he was spied on when he was giving lectures. You know, it was a real police state because he was going up against the bureaucracy. Long story short, he was actually put to hard labor. Liszt was. And the only way out of hard labor was to go into exile. And he finally chooses to go into exile in Austria and France and England. He travels a lot, Switzerland. And, but at a certain point in 1825, and he has met, by the way, Lafayette, General Lafayette of the American Revolution. That's one of the connections. And Lafayette is coming to the United States in 1825 in the 50-year anniversary of the start of the American Revolution of 1775. And he invites Liszt to come with him. So Liszt comes, and I'd like to run the next slide, I think. Yeah. This is what Liszt says. Afterwards, I visited the United States. I cast all books aside. They would have only tended to mislead me. The best work on political economy, which one can read in that modern land, is actual life. Mm. There one may see wildernesses grow into rich and mighty states, and progress which requires centuries in Europe, goes on there before one's eyes. Mm. That from the condition of the mere hunter to the rearing of cattle, from that to agriculture, from that to manufactures and commerce. And Liszt was able to travel quite a bit. He was able to meet with Henry Clay, who is later a very important influence on Lincoln. Henry Carey, also an influence on Lincoln in terms of economists. President Madison. He actually intersects about 4 presidents while he's here. But it's interesting because think of the period we're talking about. He comes to America in 1825. Now, we're in the not only American Revolution, post-war of 1812. And you know what, if those who know this history know that after the American Revolution, we had a great economic progress under Hamiltonian economics. But by the time leading into the War of 1812, we had lost a lot of our capabilities. We had given up a lot of our manufacturing capabilities and barely won the War of 1812, remember, against the British again, because we had to revive our manufacturing in the United States. And so
Our Navy.
And our Navy, exactly. We had to revive much of what, like if you look at America today, what we've lost, well, you know, it was revived to win a war. And when List comes, he's seeing some of the, you know, aftermath of that progress. It goes on to say, in a country devoted to mere agriculture, dullness of mind, awkwardness of body, obstinate adherence to old notions, customs, methods, and processes, want of culture, of prosperity, and of liberty prevail. The spirit of striving for a steady increase in mental and bodily acquirements of emulation and of liberty characterize, on the contrary, a state devoted to manufactures and commerce. And that's what he saw throughout the United States. Now, we were 24 states at that time.
And so what year are we talking about?
1825, he comes to America, and he lives here for about 7 years. He ends up residing in Reading, Pennsylvania. And interestingly, he discovers anthracite, where in the area where he lives in Reading, Pennsylvania. So what does he do? Well, in order to get the anthracite out of the ground and into the ports, they have to build railroads. And when he was in exile in Europe, he'd seen some of the rail in Europe, but he wanted railroad, and there was no railroad in this area of Reading, and Tamaulipas and Port Clinton is the area of Pennsylvania. So he basically organizes to get a railroad built. And I won't go through the details of it, but you know, he's a real organizer. He also becomes editor of the local Reading, Pennsylvania newspaper for the German-speaking population. This happens to be a largely German-speaking area, which apparently when he came to the United States, he did not speak very, very good English. But here's the thing that's so interesting. In the middle of all this, he becomes also very active with a man by the name of Ingersoll. I mentioned Clay and Carey, inviting a whole series of pamphlets because he becomes one of the biggest polemicists in the United States against Adam Smith, against the British system. The British system is based on the idea of no nation. The British system is based on the idea that you don't need a government. World government is fine. You don't need, individuals know how to get what they need. That's the way you go under an economic system of the British system. The individual is what matters, not the nation. And the idea that it's the exchange of values, i.e. money, that becomes what you measure. And that's exactly what we're up against today. The monetary system versus that the power of a nation is defined by the mental capital, the intellectual capital, where, for example, one of the things that List insists is that, that the railroad development be steam engines, because much of the rail was still being pulled by animals. And so he wanted steam engine, where a small number of men could perform the work that previously would have taken millions of people. I mean, that's a very interesting idea. Where, imagine, he says, a cripple can accomplish more by directing a steam engine than the strongest man could ever with his mere hand. So this is the idea of man and technology. The last quote here. Thus, in the manufacturing state, genius is valued and rewarded more highly than skill. and skill more highly than mere physical force. In the agricultural state, however, accepting the public service, the reverse is almost the rule. And this was a major battle. List wrote many pamphlets that were very important because there was a faction fight in the United States by this point between the free trade faction, led by people like Thomas Cooper, who believed in slavery and was from South Carolina, wanted to, in fact, at a certain point, secede, have the southern states secede from the North. So, sound familiar? So this is really, what List and his faction were up against. And List was really quite a polemicist. And even though English was not his first language, he was usually the one that wrote these pamphlets. And were published in newspapers, I should say, around the country, because there was big fights over the tariff question, protectionism, the idea that we were going to protect our manufacturing. You can go on to the next slide. Now, interesting what he says. It is very common, clever device that when anyone has attained the summit of greatness, he kicks away the ladder by which he has climbed up, in order to deprive others of the means of climbing up after him. In this lies the secret of the cosmopolitical doctrine of Adam Smith, and of the cosmopolitical tendencies of his great contemporary William Pitt, and of all his successors in the British government administrations. The English were the greatest bullies and good-for-nothing characters in Europe. So,
What is the cartoon? I can't.
I'll show you in a minute. This was his book, The National System of Political Economy, which I think he finished when he went back to Europe. He leaves the United States in 1832. I read things that said, boy, was that stupid of him to have left the United States. He could have made so much money here. But he pined to go back to Germany. And he had a family, he had 4 children, a wife. She was obviously a very devoted wife. And he goes back to Germany with this commitment. He's going to see the railroads built in Europe, in Germany, and he's going to get the Zollverein. This is the customs union. And in 1834, January 1st, the Zollverein is actually put in place politically, legally. What is that? Well, you see these toll booths, right? Here's one wagon. One conveyance has to pay 3 tolls. This toll, that toll, and this toll. It's kind of a caricature of the problem. But Germany was 34 principalities, I believe. And to go from one principality to the next, it was like each government was its own private government. And you had to pay tolls through each area you went.
So like the Texas toll roads.
I was just going to say that. Does that remind you of something here? In fact, Liz points out that you paid the customs according to the weight of the wagon. Now, most goods that were produced, let's say in France, wine, Britain, they would import maybe some
Mutton.
lace, buttons,
Cheese.
maybe some cheese. But in Germany, it's manufacturing. So the highest tolls, and he actually goes through a whole comparison, the highest tolls paid are by the German manufacturers. They're the ones who really get hit in the wallet on this. So he creates a whole political movement around getting rid of these tolls and what they call creating the Zollverein, which is officiated January 1st at midnight, 1834.
They also did it as you went down the Rhine or any of the rivers. As you came across the land of a different prince, they had their hands out.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, when I first came around LaRouche's thinking, one of the first things that amazed me about what he said was, do you know that mass transit should be free? Do you realize that subways shouldn't cost you anything? Buses shouldn't cost you anything? No. Really, she said. They should not, because if we were thinking about an economy where we were increasing the mental capital, and this is, I think, what China has so succeeded in doing, not only in their own nation, but in the nations that have decided they're going to go for this win-win proposal, is that the idea that you are going to take away the obstacles that inhibit the ability for people to learn from each other, to have commerce, to have the social capabilities between populations and break down these kind of barriers. You know, some would argue, well, but isn't that free trade? No, it's the idea that we're going to find a common interest of mankind. And what he polemicizes and goes after on Adam Smith is, Adam Smith, the British, are always pushing, why don't you and he go into that European Union? How about that one? Why don't you go into that European Union? We'll just stay out and, you know, pick up the pieces as you guys fall apart. That's the British method every single time. They pushed free trade, but they didn't do it with their own, or at least for a great deal of their history, they didn't do it for their own production. But that's how they would put nations into the kind of colonial backwardness that would create the kind of poverty we see in so much of the world that the Chinese are now addressing. So I'm going to wrap it up for questions, but let's just show the last maps, Mike, just so we can just. This is the Cross Isthmus Canal the Chinese have offered to build with Nicaragua. This would be the largest groundbreaking project in history. There's a lot of controversy over it, largely because this is one of the poorest countries in the world. This would open up enormous trade between the Atlantic, ultimately, and the Pacific. A great deal of this would be over a lake, which would be relatively easy, but there's a lot of areas which are swamps and wetlands, and the environmentalists don't want it, i.e. Prince Philip, Queen Elizabeth, they don't want this. But this is what China has signed the deal. It's apparently a private investor, but the Chinese are playing a major role in it. The Russians want in on it. I mean, if we were smart, wouldn't the Houston port want in on this?
Yep.
If you know any more about it, you could say, Mike. The next slide. This is, some of this is built, I can't tell you which, but this is the south to north water diversion. And
The ones on the right are built.
these are built.
That's
Right.
China, right?
This is in China, thank you. This is in China. This is where the Three Gorges Dam is on the Yangtze River. And these are the planned routes. And, you know, if you listen to interviews of people whose villages are getting swamped and flooded by these diversion projects, they all speak in glowing terms of their government, that they're proud that their water is going to be diverted, for example, up to Beijing, which has very poor water supply. They're proud to be part of a country that is actually thinking of the whole nation's development, as they are being, you know, displaced and rehoused and so forth. Next slide. The Panama Canal, which, how much of this is built, Mike, do you know?
What?
It's just open.
It's open, okay.
Yeah, they deepened it and widened it.
They deepened it and widened it, right. So this, go ahead. The Transaqua, Lake Chad is drying up, and this is the Zaire River, is that right?
Well, it was, but now they probably call it the Congo River.
Okay.
Congo
And
went back to
yeah,
Congo.
I remember when Pete was running for governor of Illinois in 1986. I remember earlier when we ran a mayoral campaign in 1982, 83. We were talking about this project. Now, this is still on the books, but because you've got so much problems with the drought, the loss of so much of the agricultural land, the migration of people that are moving out of the drought areas, this water would be diverted north. This would also be a tremendous gain into this area. Again, you know, the Boko Haram and other terrorist groups are taking advantage of the tremendous poverty and drought conditions. So this is still a fight. You know, we just had a conference on this in March in Berlin, I believe. This was one of the projects discussed with the development for all of Africa. And this is right here. I think this is Zaire. This is Chad, probably. Nigeria. Anyway, this is in Central Africa area and still has to be built, even though we called for it years ago. Is there any more, Mike? I can't remember else.
Yeah.
Oh, just lastly, I think the Nagar,
3 more.
this is an idea of a project that in the area of the Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, in which there's just a lot of conflict between Armenians and Azerbaijanis for decades and decades. And long story short, there's plans that will move development projects. They just had a conference in Baku. The Russians, the Azerbaijanis, I believe Iran is involved, China's involved. But this is, in other words, to solve these projects, these areas of conflict, you need to bring in rail, you need to bring in water development, you need to bring in civilization. What else do we have? You can go on. And this is the new high-speed rail link being built between Moscow and Kazan.
How much is done on that, Marcia?
I don't know how much is done. Do you know, Mike?
Well, they're just- they're
Wasn't there an
just-
old Trans-Siberian Railway?
Oh, yeah, that goes back to Vita. Goes back to the
So what's the blue?
You have a blue and a green there.
Trans-Siberian, I think, is built. This Moscow to Kazan would be 770 kilometers, high-speed rail. It'll cut travel from what is presently 12 hours, I'm sorry, to 3.5 hours. And
I think Texas is pretty.
you think Texas is big, right?
Yeah.
So that's on the drawing. That's to be built.
Oh,
China has won the contract on helping to build that.
wow. Has it been started, Marcia?
I don't think it's been started. I think it's still in the discussion phase, but this is all the kind of discussion that's been going on in the last couple of weeks while all the trouble in the world is going on. These projects are being planned anyway. What else do we have?
And what's that? Oh, wait, can you go back once? The red from Beijing to, what's that?
Guangzhou?
Guangzhou, that was just built. That's the high-speed rail in China, part of their, I don't know how many thousands of kilometers. Somewhere it's around 20,000.
20,000?
Right. That's a big part.
What's that in miles?
20,000 kilometers? 12,000. So just to show you, while all the difficulties are going on in the world today, the ideas of Friedrich List, the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, the ideas of our faction in history, the New Silk Road, which we have pamphlets on outside in the table outside. This is the reality that future we have to make now. So I think we have something. I think that's it for our formal discussion here. If there's any questions, we can take them. But we also have a birthday party for Friedrich List that he well deserves.
I heard you like to
Any question? Yes, Russ.
Slide you showed on the board or something, you're gonna build on the Persian Gulf around Yemen or something.
Around Yemen?
Bringing the trade down through all Iran, China, and all that kind of stuff. What is the road system there now? That would support that now.
You know, I don't know.
Where
In Yemen, he's talking about?
That port down there on what's
Chabahar?
Oh, Chabahar, in Iran.
Yeah,
In Iran.
with all China and all that, to give them a port and everything. The road systems there would support that now, would they?
Probably not.
Well, they have highways through there,
Yeah.
but they're not like highways like, we think of highways. But that's the whole point, right? These areas need these transportation routes built so that they're connected.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of the roads there now that they're using are dirt, right?
There are definitely that. But I've seen a map that shows a major road that's going along the coast.
Yeah.
It's going along right along here, along the coast, from like Karachi over to. There's a major port city here. I don't know what, I can't remember the name of it, but in Pakistan, and then what? Yeah, that sounds right. Now you gotta cut those small,
I know, dear.
half, about that half that
I
size.
know. That's
Oh, I see. No, but in the process of building it, of course, you have to bring in a lot of good equipment. So therefore, they were building those